What's up, everyone? Welcome to Mets Off Day Live. I'm your host, Chelsea Sherrod. We have finally made it on. We apologize for the delay, but I'm so excited to be here, joined by independent sports journalist who you can find on YouTube at I am Joon Lee, Mr. Joon Lee. Joon, thanks so much for joining us. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me on. My Celtics did not pull through last night, so I could be doing better. But I'm glad to be on the show.
You're recuperating. It's okay. Well, all of us, I guess you are in New York, but the majority of New York is, screaming and running around today. So
Yes,
sorry
it's
that
not
we
great
have
when
to
you're.
think about your sorrows.
It's not great when your super is taunting you about your favorite basketball team losing. So
You know, they definitely did not put you in a good position, but shout out to the Knicks for going up 2-0 against the Celtics. But we're here to talk about the Mets. So let's recap some of their recent series, Joon. So the Mets took 2 of 3 from the Diamondbacks after Wednesday's 7-1 win. They're just 5-5, though, over their last 10 games. They still sit atop the division, though their hot start has fairly cooled down a bit. So, Joon, what are your thoughts on the Mets' performance so far this season?
yeah, I think that they're in a good spot. I mean, this is one of those things where you're going to go 500. It's a baseball season. There's 162 games, so it's hard to overreact to any one stretch of games, especially when the team is this talented. And it feels like there's a lot of good energy behind this team right now, especially after the signing of Soto. And so, it's great that they got off to a hot start because we've seen how quickly things can get really nihilistic and apocalyptic almost when the Mets start off a season as poorly as they have in the past. And so, given how much the expectations have weighed on this team so far, I think it's a good thing that the team is off to such a hot start and, is trying to kind of find the balance where, it's not sustainable to play as good as they did for the first few weeks of the season.
Yeah, for sure. And also, the season is so long. So there's going to be the ebbs and flows, the highs and lows of a year. So you can only hope that they try to stay as consistent as they are. But when you are off to a hot start, it is kind of tough to kind of come down from that because, yes, New York Mets fans are very impatient. And as you know, New York sports fans in general, we just want everything right now. But you mentioned Juan Soto. He hit 2 homers yesterday, but overall, he hasn't looked like himself, so to speak. Speaking of Mets fans being impatient, especially with runners in scoring position, do you think that he is just unlucky or is he pressing? What do you think it is with Juan Soto?
I think it's a couple things happening right now. First, if you look at Soto's career statistics in April, it's always been the slowest start. He always starts slow with seasons. In his career, he's hitting like 253, I believe, in the month of April. So what he's doing right now is actually not that different from his career norms. Of course, on top of that, he's got the pressure of having the biggest contract in baseball history now. So there's that. But if you go to Baseball Savant, you look at all the peripherals, you look at all the advanced statistics, everything is kind of in par for what he's done over the course of his career. He's still hitting the ball hard. He's barreling up the ball hard. I think the numbers not being up there is partially due to luck, probably partially due to the pressure of being the highest paid baseball player in history. But I think overall, this is kind of in line with who Juan Soto has been. And as the weather gets warmer, he tends to heat up as well.
It does. But yeah, I also do think it does come down to a bit of pressure and also just kind of getting into a groove, being that now you're with a new team too. But Pete Alonso seems like he is handling the pressure very well, if there is any pressure on him at this point. He was named the NL Player of the Month for April. How important has his success been to the team overall? And I think that's
Well,
also like understated too.
yeah, I mean, I think Pete is the heart and soul of the Mets in many singles way. He's the guy who came up through the franchise and has been one of the most popular players, not just on the Mets but in baseball. He's one of those guys that is kind of on the border of being a transcendent outside of baseball star because he plays in a big market like New York and he's as beloved as he is. He does have something to prove, especially after this past offseason, not getting the big contract that him and Scott Boras wanted. And so I think when you look at Pete's situation in particular, there is a desire for him to go out and show that even at 30 years old, that maybe he was a little bit undervalued on the trade market. That being said, it's debatable whether or not, he got fair market value. He is a first baseman and, he's not the best defensive first baseman. There are a lot of people who hit for a lot of power, but it is undeniable that Pete Alonso hits the ball harder than just about anyone in the entire sport. And while he is a first baseman that, doesn't have, bring as much to the table as a the center fielder does or shortstop does in terms of the defensive stuff. It's hard to kind of raise your defensive war when you're playing first base and raise your overall value profile as a player. I think Pete's biggest value to this team is just being that consistent guy on a day-to-day basis. Like, you go into the Mets clubs, he's always upbeat. He's always trying to be the same guy on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't really matter whether or not he's having a good stretch or a bad stretch. He tends to be kind of the same and always trying to, be an uplifting guy, banter with his teammates. And so when he is doing good, I think it's one of those things that really kind of keeps the fan base energy up because, everyone loves Pete in New York. And so when Pete's doing well, it's a lot easier for Mets fans to just feel good about what's going on and navigate the ups and downs of the season.
Yeah, when he is playing well, it does have a positive ripple effect, I think, across the entire organization. And he's been the driving force of this offense, too. Let's go through some injury updates. So, June, the Mets continue to deal with injuries. Jesse Winker is now expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks with an oblique strain. And Brett Baty is back in the big leagues now. We talk about pressure for Juan Soto, and it seems like Brett Baty is feeling a bit of pressure, and he's trying to navigate that. But so far, he's kind of been this up and down guy. Do you think that this is his last best shot to prove that he belongs in the big leagues?
I'm not sure about the big leagues. That might be taking it a bit too far, but I wonder if this is his last opportunity with the Mets, because I remember when he was coming up, Mets fans were clamoring for him to make it up to the major leagues and make an impact, because it was at that point, it was between him and Vientos for the third base spot. And there was a lot of demand for someone to fill that spot who was a young player, because what was going on there at the time just wasn't working for them. And so I do think that Baty's in the spot where, he's had more than a full season in the big leagues at this point, if you add up the games. And he hasn't hit above, I think it was above 230. And so, it might be that the pressure and the spotlight of being in New York, doesn't necessarily vibe with who he is as a player. I know that fans were really excited about him when they came up, and with that comes a lot of expectations. I remember when, as a Red Sox fan myself, seeing Bobby Dahlbeck come out in Boston, and there was a lot of expectation and a lot of excitement from fans because he's this power hitting first baseman, and he had a good first couple of weeks. And after that, he kind of tailed off because of the ups and downs of playing a big market and the pressure that comes with that. So, I'm not sure that this is the end of Brett Baty's career. Major teams tend to give top prospects a little bit more leeway, especially that track record from the minor leagues. And we've seen guys, not that Brett Baty was one of the top 5 prospects in baseball, but you see a guy like Jurickson Profar, who was at one point the top prospect in all of baseball, really kind of struggled to kind of establish himself in the big leagues over the course of his first few seasons. But he was able to kind of continue getting opportunities because he had that track record for talent. So I'm not sure that it's the end of Brett Baty's professional baseball career, but I do think that if he doesn't really stick at this time, it's going to be hard for the Mets to justify continuing to give him chances in this market.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Profar, but have you seen other players who are like Brett Baty who rake in the minors, but just can't quite find their footing in the majors? Why do you think that is? What do you attribute that to? Do you think it just is a pressure thing? Do you think there is an adjustment period? And some people will probably say that adjustment period has probably come and gone for Brett Baty. But what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of different things. I think that there's often an underestimation for the gap between the talent level in AAA versus the talent level in the major leagues, because the best pitcher in AAA is maybe a quadruple A guy or a top prospect who's not going to be in AAA for that long. So it's not like you're seeing this consistent exposure to, high level pitching that you're going to see at the major league level. At the major league level, you're literally facing Hall of Fame guys who've been established major league veterans for 10 plus years, guys who've made all-star games. That's the type of stuff that you're seeing on a night-to-night basis. And so the gap between AA and AAA and the gap between AAA and the major leagues, it's not even remotely close. And so even if you do put up these numbers in the minor leagues and you're putting up against, some of the best young talent in all of baseball, it's a completely different ball game when consistently you're starting to face guys who are Hall of Fame or some of the best people who've ever played. And on top of that, have more data, more strategy, have more experience than you do. And so, the thing that I often see is that guys come up to the major leagues, are very confident after going through a hot streak. And then once they start to struggle and teams start to adjust to them and they have the scouting report and they see, this guy's swing leaves a hole in the inside part of the plate. So you got to attack him with, 90-mile-per-hour fastballs inside or sweepers on the outside. There's, they identify the holes in these swings. If you don't adjust back and then your self-confidence starts to crumble, it's just this like snowball effect where, the moment that you can really see whether or not a guy is going to be capable of sustaining a major league career is if they're able to get out of that first slump, because lots of guys have a hot first 2 weeks in the major leagues before teams have a scouting report on them. It's when you start to struggle and teams do have a scouting report that if you're able to adjust back, if you're able to adjust your approach at the plate, able to adjust your mechanics to close any holes in your swing, that's when you start to see whether or not a guy can really stick it in the big leagues for the long term.
Yeah, for sure. That's the difference between guys who are good and guys who are great. But on the flip side, though, June, Luis Angel Acuna struggled in the minors, but has been a key contributor so far. Do players ever just get bored in the minors and only turn it on once they get into the big leagues? Like, is that a legitimate thing?
Well, I think that there is this effect of people playing up to their competition. There's a level of, I am playing amongst the best guys now, and they felt confident enough that they almost didn't have to try as hard going up through the minor leagues because they felt confident that once they got to the big leagues that they would adjust. We've seen that over the course of history. There's plenty of times where the number one prospect in all of baseball, doesn't become a star, but then you'll see a guy come out of nowhere and become a superstar. Like that happens almost year after year in some ways. And so, I think that when you see guys who kind of step up to that, there's a level of competitiveness and playing up to your competition. Is that, sustainable for the long term? It's kind of questionable depending on the guy to guy. Like I tend to see that, especially in baseball when the seasons are so long, that the kind of even keeled personalities who are able to kind of ride the ups and downs and accept that the ups and downs of the season are inevitable are the types of people who are able to sustain long major league careers. But there is a degree to which some people just like play up to their competition. We see this with teams too. So I think that there's a degree to which some people just like to, have the brightest lights on them and they shine in those moments.
Yeah, Luis Angel Acuna is definitely shining. Two more arms went down this week, though, June. AJ Minter and Danny Young are out for the season. David Stearns has had a knack for finding bullpen gems. Do you trust Stearns to replace someone as effective as AJ Minter? Where's your trust level?
It's hard to replace AJ Minter because that guy's like one of the 35 best relievers in baseball who isn't a closer. At the same time, a guy like David Stearns has made his career building bullpens, and that's kind of the plan for a lot of these teams these days. Is that you have a rotation of maybe 10, almost 15 guys between the major leagues and the minor leagues that aren't your closer, that aren't your setup men, who are kind of interchangeable, and you kind of ride those guys as hard as you can. A bunch of guys, might have good arms, but maybe not the control to last over the course of a season. So you try to ride them when they're hot, and then if they fall off, you send them down. You try to shuttle the other guy back up, and so this is kind of how the modern bullpen is constructed. Where it's not like you start a season with a group of 7 to 8 guys, and that's the crew that you ride out for the entire season. There's kind of this level of built-in flexibility that teams have now where, you have your closer, you have Edwin Diaz, and then you have your setup guy. And then you have a bunch of other guys who, are kind of fringe, and maybe you'll ride them hard for a couple weeks. And then once they start to struggle, you'll send them down. And so David Stearns' reputation has always been able to find these kind of diamond in the rough type gems. That's the strength of a lot of these analytically general managers. And I feel confident that they'll be able to find someone, but it might not just be one guy replacing AJ Minter, because that's not really the strategy that teams to build up.
Yeah, for sure. Good points by you. Across the majors, though, starters aren't going deep into games. We're seeing a lot of starters go 4 innings or 5, and that just seems like that's how the tide is turning right now in the majors. What can teams do to protect their bullpens from burnout? Because again, we talk about the ripple effect or the positive ripple effect that Pete Alonso is having in the lineup, but there also is a ripple effect from the starters to the pen when starters aren't going as long into games. So what do you think that teams can do to prevent or to protect the pen?
I think it's building off of what I was just talking about, where you have this like huge group of guys almost who are major league ready in some capacity, but maybe aren't consistent enough on a week-to-week basis to be there for the entire season. So it's really leaning on those guys. It's leaning on not just 7 or 8 relievers, but relying on 20 guys throughout the course of your organization. I think this is kind of where things have gone with the analytically inclined GMs, where you want to have a lot of organizational depth. It's why you're going to see major league veterans who are signing minor league contracts to try to stick it out and see if they can extend their careers because they can get shuttled into the major leagues on a moment's notice. There's so much reliance now on relievers. And I think what has happened with the shift to high velocity is that guys now train for that. So you're seeing so many more guys, no-name guys, relievers who are coming up who are already pumped 98 miles per hour. And like 15 years ago, one guy pumping 98 was this massive anomaly that you didn't necessarily expect to see. But I think in today's game, because everyone is pumping such hard velocity and they don't necessarily need control, they just need vaguely in the strike zone in some ways, they're able to rely on a larger crew of people. And so it's going to be interesting to see, because I think that there has a lot of talk and concern about the rise in and whether this is kind of a method to build out a team and its roster. And so I'm curious to see if we're going to start seeing starters stretch back out. I mean, trends going well in baseball, and I feel like we're starting to hit kind of the point of like, do we need, like, asking the question, like, do we need starters if guys are going 4 innings? Like, how are we actually managing pitching staffs now? Are we just going to rely on a bunch of like swingmen? It's going to be really interesting to see how the game develops, if we're going to continue leaning harder into this like start direction, or things are going to start to swing back the other way.
Yeah. So like, what's the measuring stick, so to speak? I think that's the question too. But June, the Mets starting rotation has exceeded expectations, even without Sean Manaea and Frankie Montas. We saw Blade Tidwell make a start last weekend. With Brandon Sproat and Nolan McLean also thriving in AAA, could you see the Mets running some version of a bullpen game where they can send 2 starters out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not inconceivable. I mean, the Mets rotation is kind of the big question mark for this team right now. Like, you have Kodai Senga, who's been incredible this year, but he's also had injury concerns. So, we've seen him go down in the middle of the season when he's had these hot streaks, and it can often play a big role in derailing the Mets season in the last few years. And so that is something to watch. The depth is a little concerning. Like, I'm curious to see how this Clay Holmes experiment goes. Like, we don't often see guys kind of mid-career shift from going to the bullpen to the starting rotation. And so, obviously Clay Holmes has that incredible, change up and that rotation, that arsenal. And so I'm curious to see how that kind of experiment continues to develop. But for me, this is the big concern for this Mets team, and is going to be a huge determinant on whether or not they're an actual World Series contender this year. Are they going to be able to piece together this patchwork rotation, especially when the injuries are there? Or, are they going to have to go out and get someone at the deadline to fill these gaps? Like, when you look at this Mets roster, the rotation especially is kind of the glaring red flag right now.
And so we talked about pitchers not going super long into games. They only have so many innings in their arms, both in a season and over their careers. Does it ever feel like you're wasting valuable innings in the minors when you know that you're major league ready? Is that a thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's part of the larger trend we've seen across baseball. I would say that the beginning of this was when Mike Trout and Bryce Harper came up from the minor leagues at 19, 20, 21 years old. That was pretty unheard of back then, but it's become pretty commonplace. Like, we're starting to see guys debut in a year after they graduated from college. Paul Skeens was barely in the minor leagues before he got up to the majors. I think that the way that teams value young arms now, and young players in general, is that they don't want to run guys into the ground in the minor leagues. They'd rather them try to experiment. So what you're seeing, both from the hitter perspective and from the pitching perspective, is a lot more unpolished guys making it to the major leagues on the pure merit of their stuff, and teams figuring out, like, is this guy an actual guy in the major leagues? And so, I remember the days where the top prospect would be in the minor leagues until 24, 23, 24, maybe even 25 old. And 25 now for some major leaguers and how teams evaluate them is kind of considered old for a young player. So
Yeah,
the framework of how we even think about a player's value has changed. And it's crazy. Like when you look at the top prospects list now, like someone like Roman Anthony, who's the number one prospect in all of baseball, probably has more trade value than most of Major League Baseball, and he hasn't actually played a game. It's all about projection and almost the fantasy of like what this guy can become. But that's just how teams evaluate what someone is worth to a franchise now. You know, it's almost it's almost more like it feels like these days that the fantasy of what someone can become is almost more valuable than having actual hard data. And
for sure.
I don't know how long that's going to be a thing,
Yeah.
but it's a trend that hasn't seemed to slow down over the course of the last decade.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that. Okay, let's switch to the upcoming series. The Mets take on the 22-16 Chicago Cubs. The next 3 games, they'll see an old friend and former first-round pick, Pete Crow Armstrong, who the Mets traded for Javi Baez in 2021. PCA has an .837 OPS, 9 homers, 12 stolen bases with 6 defensive runs saved so far this season. June, have trades like that made teams more hesitant to give up top prospects for one-year rentals? What do you think? We did just talk about kind of the tide turning there with people kind of putting a lot more value on like projections. What do you think?
It's an interesting question because I think when you go back to when the Mets got Javi Baez, the fans really wanted the Mets to get someone like Javi Baez. So it's easy to look back now knowing how big of a disaster the whole Javi Baez situation was in New York, to be like, damn, we traded Pete Crow Armstrong and, you know, we got Javi Baez in return. Like at the time, that was not how the trade was received by Mets fans and people across baseball. That being said, I do think that the way that you value prospects shifting has kind of changed the dynamics. I think that, you know, when you're trading for a rental, you probably are aiming for, you know, Javi Baez was at one point one of the best second basemen in baseball. He wasn't quite that when the Mets traded for him, deadlines ago. I think that the bar to give up a top prospect, a first-round pick like Pete Crow Armstrong, is probably a little bit higher now than it was before, especially because teams are willing to just let guys succeed or even flail at the major league level at a younger age. And so I think that kind of scale and balance has shifted a little bit more towards like keeping prospects and hoarding prospects almost. But we're going to start to see a wave of teams, I think, sign these young players to contracts extensions before they even accomplish anything. Like I remember like Jonathan Singleton with the Astros, like that was kind of the first wave of that happening when he had not played a game in the major leagues. I think he signed a $60 or $70 million a year contract. My numbers might be off there, but it was a pretty substantive deal for someone who had never played a game in the major leagues. And for a variety of reasons, his career got completely derailed. But we're starting to see this trend now where teams are signing young players who just got up to the major leagues to these contract extensions. And I mean, you saw this with the Red Sox and Christian Campbell. There's a lot of other examples across Major League Baseball right now. A bunch of those contracts aren't going to work out. And, you know, $60-70 million to a 19-20-year-old, it's not the biggest risk in the world for these teams, especially a team like the Mets who are willing to give out $500 million for Juan Soto. And so the risk value proposition is kind of still there. But I do wonder in the next few years, we're going to start to see teams, you know, sign these young players to contracts because they come up earlier, because they view it as an opportunity to get ahead of the market and sign them for below market value for what they might get on the free agent market down the road. Yeah. And some of those contracts aren't going to work out. And so I think that there is going to be a recalibration at some point, as there always is in baseball. But I think that right now, when you look back at the Javi Baez trade, it's important to recontextualize how much Mets fans wanted someone like Javi Baez on the team back in the day, and how much I think the way that teams value prospects and now give prospects opportunities to play at younger ages in the majors have kind of shifted the way that we look at that trade in retrospect.
No, for sure. But June, when does it actually make sense for a team to go all in trading top prospects for a rental player or on a rental player? When do you think that actually does make sense?
When you think you can win a World Series and you think you're really close and you need that one guy. Like I remember when the Chicago Cubs like went all in and traded for Aroldis Chapman from the Yankees. And he was there for basically half a season and went back to the Yankees immediately afterwards. But like Chapman was completely worth it for that team. And they won their first, they broke with the curse of the Billy Goat. So like it was totally worth it. And, it's easy to look back at these trades when you go all in and be like, well, they didn't win, so it wasn't worth it. Well, you got to look at it in the moment and be like, well, how good of a chance did they actually have to win in that moment? I think if you really think that you have a chance to win the series in baseball, that threshold is lower than it is in a sport like the NBA, where, it feels like 3 or 4 teams go into the postseason actually having a chance to win the title. And it tends to be those teams. In baseball, if you make it into the playoffs, if you're a wild card team, if you're, the team with the best record in baseball, the team with the best record in baseball doesn't often even win the World Series, let alone make it to the World Series. And so I think that is a little bit more tempting in a baseball. The risk is worth it a lot more because the threshold to feel like you're in it, to actually have a chance to win the World Series, is much higher. And so that for me is like, you got a chance to win it, you should go all in. Because when GMs get a little hesitant around making these bold decisions, it's when it tends to lead to teams never actually making it over that hump. And so I would rather be in a position as a GM, if you have a chance to make it and you feel like you're getting a player back to go, because you never know when you're going to get that chance again. You never know what's going to happen with injuries. You never know how guys might fall off the cliff as they age. And so I think that when you can smell it, even if you're, a decent wild card team, it is worth going for it.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, as we wrap up the show, let's talk a little bit about the NL East. As we said earlier, the Mets are still in first place in the division, with the Phillies only 2 games behind and the Braves inching closer to 500 baseball. So, June, do you view the Mets as the favorites in the division?
I do, but with an asterisk, mostly because I am worried about that rotation. And the Phillies and the Braves are really talented rosters, and we've seen over the course of the last few years that like some dips in performance on the Braves side can lead to kind of big swing in the division. I think that these teams are all pretty close in talent, and I think we're seeing this across baseball, where there's a lot of parity right now. And even if teams are kind of hovering around that 500 mark, especially in April, like it's hard to kind of jump to major conclusions. But as of right now, especially given how much hype came into the season with Juan Soto, really jacking up the lineup, with Francisco Lindor off to a great season as well. Like we've seen so far this year, like even Juan Soto himself mentioned it, like having a guy like Aaron behind him changed. Teams are now pitching to Juan Soto the way that they pitched to Aaron Judge last year, and now Lindor and other guys higher in the lineup are seeing the benefits of that. And so, when you have a guy like Juan Soto in the center, that completely changes the calculus of how teams approach you. And I think that kind of talent is the reason why we see like Pete and Francisco have better seasons than they did last year. But this is a really talented team, and they've spent a lot of money. So, this is right now, because we've seen Steve Cohen invest a lot in the team. We've seen it happen with Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander. This is a kind of a different type of investment, because Verlander and Scherzer were at, kind of close to the end of their careers. Juan Soto's in his prime. This is a team with a foundation that we should expect to see together and doing well for at least a couple of years, especially with Pete at age 30. And so, my expectations, if I was a Mets fan, is like, you should be winning the division this year. But that rotation does scare me, especially with the injuries so far.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, like, yes, given how high the expectations were coming into the year, and also I think the way that they've started out the season, given the injuries that they've been dealing with, especially to the starters, to the rotation, I think that they're proving that they should be the favorites in the division. So that's why I think that they should stay. All right, that's going to do it for us here on Mets Off Day Live. June, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you on. And we will see you guys next Thursday, May 15th, when we return for our next Mets Off Day Live. For Chelsea Sherrod and Joon Lee, we'll see you guys later.